Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a talk by Dan McCue and Alex Hermann, reviewing and updating the Center's State of the Nation's Housing Report. Before I introduce Dan and Alex, I want to let you know about a few other upcoming events. 2 weeks from today, on Friday, September 30th, our Housing Research Seminar will continue at 12:15 p.m. when Jacob Anbinder, a PhD candidate in history, who's one of our Meyer doctoral fellows, will be speaking about his dissertation research in an online talk titled Community Control or Controlling the Community, the Neighborhood Growth Revolt and the New Urban Liberalism, 1960 to 1990. This is really interesting research. Some of you may have seen a recent article about Jacob's work in Harvard Magazine, looking at the sea change in urban politics in the second half of the 20th century and the rise of community control and some of its implications. An hour later, on that same day, is the official start of Hackahouse 2022. This is an annual competition organized by Ivory Innovations and co-sponsored by the Center, which gives undergraduates and graduate students from around the country the opportunity to participate in a 24-hour hackathon-style competition focused on some key housing-related challenges. You can find more information about that on our website. And about a week after that, on Thursday, October 6th at 11 a.m., we'll host Housing and Health Equity for Older Adults. At this online event, Jen Malinsky, Project Director of the Center's Housing and Aging Society program, will present key findings from a new report reviewing equitable community-based aging policies and practices, recap, during COVID. Jen will then participate in a panel discussion that'll be moderated by Nancy Berlinger, a research scholar at the Hastings Center, our partner in this project. More details about these and other upcoming events are available on our website, www.jchs.harvard.edu. Now, on to today's presentation, which, as I said, features Dan McCue and Alex Hermann, both senior researchers at the Center, who together manage the team effort that produces the Center's annual State of the Nation's Housing Report, which we've produced annually for over 3 decades. The most recent report, which was released in June, noted that after a record-shattering year in 2021, housing markets appeared to be at what the report calls an inflection point. Interest rates and inflation were rising, government programs that helped many struggling households at the height of the pandemic were ending, and there were signs that the economy was slowing and that we might even be entering a recession. So we all want to know, what's happened since June when we were at that inflection point? Drawing on some new data, Dan and Alex will try to provide at least a preliminary overview of what's happened since that time. They're going to take about 40 minutes. There's a lot to go over. That'll leave us a little bit of time for questions, some of which I have, but you can also pose using Zoom's Q&A. We'll also try and answer some of those questions online where we can. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. I think it's fair to predict we'll have more questions than time, but it's really important that you post them anyway. It's a really good guide for us as to what is of most interest to folks. So, and then we'll end at about 1:15 p.m. A video of Dan and Alex's talk, the discussion, and their slides will be posted on the Center's website by early next week. Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and then I gather at one point you're going to turn it over to Alex, who then is going to turn it back to you. It's all yours.
Right, thank you, David. I'm going to give a quick introduction and then kick it over to Alex to do the first half of the presentation, and then I'll join you back for the second half. But yeah, that was a great introduction. I think when we released the State of the Nation's Housing Report earlier this year, like every year, we chronicled the major stories in housing markets and policy that we saw over the past year to put current events in context. So our themes, the themes we identified are listed here: soaring costs of housing. We're in a time when construction levels were at record highs, the affordability challenges were great. Trying to explain household growth, strong through the pandemic, despite the pandemic. Beginning to see the increasingly high hurdle of high housing costs for potential buyers with interest rates surging. the resulting inequalities that could potentially lock in, given homeownership rate gaps by race, and homeownership rate aspirations for low income households and younger households, and what that means for the outlook of for housing. And so for this presentation, where we normally review the report, so much was in flux when we put out the report that we wanted to kind of check back in on, are these still the right themes? What's happened to these themes? So let's go to the next slide. Really, just because what's driving, what's happened since we published the report. So here I got a chart. So I tried to shade out the kind of data that's come out since we published the report. What's happened since? And so, well, the first thing we noticed is inflation rates have remained extremely high. Prices continue to go up rapidly. Here, overall inflation has been up by over 8% since March, and even the core inflation hovering around 6%. So extremely high, historically high, not seen for 30 years plus rates of price increases. Shelter, housing costs are a major factor for that. What else is happening? In response to the rising prices, we all know, it's been in the news so much, the Federal Reserve has increased their target rates, which has kind of had repercussions for mortgage rates. And so mortgage rates were in the process of skyrocketing. They were up just about 2 percentage points year over year when we put out the report. They've continued to hold high, just now surging a little bit higher, hitting 6% as of the last week. So really having repercussions for housing costs that we'll get into later, but it has not eased since we put out the report. But the other thing that we were looking towards in the report is on the demand side. Unemployment has remained low. This was one of our fears. Wage growth has been strong. So still some purchasing power, some buying power, some relatively good. So isn't the worst case scenario that we were worried about in the past, that rising interest rates and a falling economy would really impact households. So given strong labor markets, strong employment still, what does this all factor? How has the supply demand? What has all of this meant for the themes that we've identified? And so this is where I hand it off to Alex to show what's happened to our first theme, the soaring costs of housing.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. I think that sets me up really well to discuss what I'm going to talk about a bit today. And to begin, I'm going to discuss one of the more notable and significant trends in the housing market since the start of the pandemic, and that's the extent and magnitude of rising housing costs across the country. To do that, I'll consider what's been transpiring in the market since the start of the pandemic, and using that to look at where we are today, which is informed a tremendous amount by what Dan was just talking about, right? So I'll look at my slides back to working. Here we go. On the for sale side of the market, home prices have risen at a rapid pace since early on in the pandemic. So nominal home prices, reflected by the orange line here on my slide, were rising double digits as early as the end of 2020. And from there, they mostly continued climbing before reaching a new peak earlier this year. So year over year, nominal home prices rose nearly 21% in the spring of 2022. And that's an all-time high in the Case-Shiller index dating back to the late 1980s. Even after adjusting for the relatively high rate of inflation that we've experienced, real home prices also reached all-time highs during the pandemic. So in August of last year, real home prices rose 12.7% annually. These rapid price increases bring home prices up significantly since March of 2020. So since the start of the pandemic, nominal home prices have risen an astounding 43%, while even real home prices in this era of relatively high inflation have still risen over 21%. And that's obviously just in a little more than 2 years. However, as you kind of look at the end of the slide there, rising interest rates and the resulting deteriorating affordability have deflated demand for housing in more recent months. And although home prices, especially nominal home prices, are still rising rapidly, we've seen price growth start to moderate nationally, right? So in June of this year, nominal home prices rose 18% year over year, while real home prices rose about 6.5%. What happens on the for sale side of the market matters significantly, of course, for what's happening on the rental market. And rents have also been rising at an unprecedented rate. After falling slightly in 2020, at least in the professionally managed apartment sector, according to CoStar, apartment rents began to rise significantly in the middle of 2021, before hitting their own record highs near 12% in the first quarter of this year. As with home prices, you've seen apartment rent growth start to moderate somewhat as well, falling to 9.5% growth in the second quarter. Single family rent growth had a stronger rent trajectory earlier in the pandemic, right? And that's when demand for space was at a premium, right? More space for working at home, for schooling, more private outdoor space. So rents on the single family side kind of shot up almost in line with what was happening in the for sale side of the market. And now, while flattening somewhat in more recent quarters, they're still continuing to chug along at a rate of about 14% in the second quarter. One thing that has made this moment so unique is how widespread the growth in housing costs has been across the country. So rapid home price and rent growth haven't been confined to a select number of coastal markets, right? But have been really significant in markets across the country. Home prices in the first quarter of this year rose double digits in 99 of the 100 large markets tracked by the FHFA, that's the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And in fact, annual price increases have hit some record high in 2/3 of these 100 markets. So in 67 markets at some point since the start of 2021. So in other words, home prices aided by low interest rates and strong demand and limited supply, things we'll continue to talk about here, were rising at some unprecedented pace in most of the nation's large housing markets. On the rental side, which is what I'm showing you here, you can see the distribution shift in just 1 year, right? So in the second quarter of 2021, which I'm showing you on the left-hand side here, just a small fraction of the 150 markets tracked by RealPage had rents rising more than 10%. In fact, it was just 2 markets, right? That small orange sliver on the right-hand side there. Fast forward 1 year later, more than 75% of those same markets, or 114 markets in total, had double-digit rent growth. And that's the dark orange bar on the right. And then nearly all of the remaining markets in the second quarter of this year were still experiencing significant rent growth, something above 5%, right? If not quite to double digits. And then you look on the other end of things, no markets were experiencing rent declines last quarter. And that's down from about 25 markets where rents were actually declining the year before, the kind of green line on the far left. And if you look at where rents have risen most, this is in the first quarter of this year, 8 of the top 10 markets for rent growth were actually in Florida. And then outside of Florida, you had rents rising more than 20% in Austin and Las Vegas and Phoenix and Raleigh and Tucson. And those are markets largely in the West and South, of course, but rents in the Midwest and Northeast have also risen significantly, right? In markets like Detroit and Columbus, Boston and New York, all are experiencing double-digit rent growth at this time. So why have housing costs risen so significantly through the pandemic, right? Dan mentioned the historically low interest rates we've experienced earlier, and we'll talk more about the persistence and composition of housing demand in a few minutes. But a lack of supply also plays an important role. And what I mean really, right, is the extreme dearth of homes available for people to actually live in. We'll continue with the rental side of the market, where vacancy rates in the professionally managed apartment sector rose significantly early on in the pandemic, driven in particular by softening demand in dense urban areas. But in more recent quarters, right, vacancy rates have fallen to historic lows. So in the third quarter of 2021, vacancy rates for the professionally managed apartment sector fell to a record low 4.8%. And that's in data dating back to the early 2000s. Vacancy rates have ticked up since, right? Climbing to a little more than 5%, 5.1% by the second quarter of this year. But still, vacancy rates are about 1 percentage point lower than the vacancy rate that was averaged the 5 years before the pandemic from 2015 to 2019. So in other words, markets remain extremely tight on the rental side. It's also worth stating that this market tightness extends beyond the professionally managed sector, right? So earlier this year, the national vacancy rate, according to the Census Bureau's housing vacancy survey, fell to about 5.5%, which is tied for the lowest quarterly reading we've seen since 1984 in that series, right? So such low levels of vacancies make it harder, of course, for renters to find suitable housing at their desired price point and in the geography that they're looking at. And they also contribute to the rising rents we've seen across the country. The pandemic also exacerbated significant supply issues on the for sale side of the market. So the number of homes available for sale across the country hit an all-time low earlier this year. In January and February, just 850,000 existing homes were available for sale across the country. And that's about 17% lower than the year before and about 40% lower than those same months immediately preceding the pandemic. And that was already a period when housing supply was already pretty constricted, right? But inventories have also hopefully turned a corner, right? After falling year over year for 36 straight months, going back to the middle of 2019. If you look at the far end of the slide here again, for sale inventories finally saw their first year over year increase in June. It's a small but meaningful 1.5% increase, but still, right, again, the supply of homes and markets, supply of homes available remain extremely tight. The pandemic exacerbated these supply issues in a number of ways, right? But one major culprit among many has been investor activity. So according to data from CoreLogic I'm showing here, investors purchased 28% of single-family homes sold in the first quarter of this year, up from 19% a year earlier and 16% average immediately before the pandemic, so from 2017 to 2019. When investors increase their activity in this way, they reduce the already limited supply of homes available to potential owner occupants, especially first-time and more moderate income buyers. In part, that's because investors are more likely to buy lower-priced homes, right? These homes are then typically converted to rentals or upgraded and flipped at higher price points. But in any case, investor activity does limit the potential pool of homes for sale for owner occupants. And it's worth noting, I think, that investors, even though I don't show it here, especially small and mid-sized investors, have also been impacted by rising interest rates and, of course, other broad economic factors. So in June, investors bought 20% of single-family homes sold, which is higher than the historic norm, but still a significant reduction from recent quarters. So this investor activity is something we'll be watching going forward to see how things continue to evolve. To recap briefly, housing costs during the pandemic rose to extraordinary, often unprecedented heights, and that stayed true through late 2021 and early 2022. But as we move later into the year, these escalating costs combine with rising interest rates to deflate demand and make housing less affordable, right? And as a result, you begin to see some important signs of normalization or moderation, right? Vacancy rates and inventories ticking up, rents and home prices moderating a bit, and that easing is likely to continue. But for now, it remains the case that this is an extraordinarily tight housing market on both the for sale and rental sides. And these market conditions have a number of important implications for households. In just a few minutes, Dan will consider how these conditions create barriers for potential home buyers and the extent to which they exacerbate existing inequities. But market conditions also have important implications for affordability. So soaring costs, of course, make housing less affordable, and these are part of long-term challenges, of course, that households across the country have faced for many years. Here at the center, we consider a household housing cost burden if they spend more than 30% of their income on housing. The most recent data we have on cost burdens is from 2020. And these data show that housing affordability worsened in the first year of the pandemic. And recall, this is long before we hit record highs in both home price and rent growth, right? But in 2020, the share of households with cost burdens rose 1.5 percentage point to just over 30% of all households. Cost burden rates for homeowners rose 1 percentage point as part of that to 21%, but cost burdens for renters rose especially rapidly at 2.5 percentage points, leaving 46% of renters with burdens in 2020. Because of their greater affordability challenges, I'm going to focus on renters here. Looking at the right side panel, lower income renters are especially likely to be cost burdened, with over 80% of renters with incomes below $30,000 experiencing cost burdens in 2020, and that's up almost 5 whole percentage points from 2019. However, the increase in cost burdens was even greater for middle income renters, right? The share of renters with cost burdens among those earning between $30,000 and $45,000 increased more than 9 percentage points in 2020, and that's to just over 58%. So these affordability challenges have, of course, persisted deeper into the pandemic as well. Nearly 15% of renters early this year reported being behind on their rental payments, right? So just as lower income renters are more likely to be cost burdened, they're also more likely to fall behind on their housing payments. So about 1/5 of renters earning under $25,000 were behind on their rent earlier this year. And that's 4.5 times higher than those earning $75,000 and over. So almost 5 times the rate of falling behind on your rent, lower income renters compared to higher income renters. Households of color are also far more likely to be behind on their rent. So over 23%, almost a quarter of Black renters, and 18% of Hispanic and Asian renters were in arrears, compared with about 9.5% of white households. One of the most severe potential consequences of people falling behind on their rent, of course, is the prospect of eviction. And this figure shows the rate of eviction filings in a number of states and cities nationally relative to their historical average from 2012 to 2016. And as you can see, eviction fell sharply shortly after the start of the pandemic. So in April of 2020, eviction filings were at about 9% of their historic rate. From there, evictions climbed mostly through the end of 2020, fell in early 2021, and have had this unsteady rise again since. So in 2022, the number of eviction filings have continued to rise back to near historical averages. So in April, May, and June, eviction filings were at about 87% of their historic norm. We've talked a bit about what rising inflation means for the housing market overall, but rising prices also matter significantly for household budgets. So in August, general inflation was up more than 8%, as Dan noted, a significant increase over the last handful of years and more. But if you look, right, inflation of fuels and utilities was up 17%, for food and beverages, up 11%, for apparel, up 5%, right, all rising considerably over previous years. And this rise in prices is especially problematic for low-income households who already often have very little left over after paying for housing. So in 2019, lower income renters, those earning under $30,000, had just $490 left over each month after accounting for the rent to spend on all other household needs. But with both housing costs and these other costs, these costs of other kinds of essentials, both rising, lower income households are now getting squeezed from both ends. One of the primary mechanisms for alleviating these market conditions and improving affordability is through increased housing construction. And as our report documents, construction was strong in 2021. And that's occurred despite some very significant challenges affecting both home builders and developers, right? For one, rising prices have, of course, mattered for consumers, but they've also mattered on the supply side. So the cost of building materials has risen considerably since the start of the pandemic. And as of February, inputs to new residential construction were rising 20% year over year. And that includes substantial rises in plastic construction products and gypsum and clay tile, concrete, and more. Rising costs are related to shortages of building materials and make new housing construction difficult to complete and bring to market, along with a host of other barriers to new housing development, right? Including lot availability and land prices, local land use regulations, labor shortages, and more. All these things combine to inhibit new housing development. But despite these challenges, the number of new housing starts in 2021 hit a 15-year high. Housing starts rose 16% to 1.6 million units last year, the highest total since 2006. On the single family side, which is reflected by that orange line up top there, construction rose 14% to just over 1.1 million units. And that follows a 13-year period where single family housing construction did not top 1 million housing starts, which is about in line with historical averages going back to 1990. Multifamily construction was even stronger last year, with the number of units started in multifamily structures rising 22% to 474,000 units. And that's the highest level we've seen since 1987. But rising interest rates and deteriorating affordability have significantly affected new housing supply as well. New housing starts have fallen significantly with rising rates, and that's entirely driven by what's happening on the single family side of things. So here we're showing you the number of housing starts in each month since 2015 at a seasonally adjusted annual rate. And you can see that in 2022 that I've shaded here, right? Single family housing starts, which are represented by that orange line, have declined significantly back down to historical averages or below historical averages. So from May through June, single family starts declined about 11.5% on average year over year. Meanwhile, multifamily construction actually continues to chug along at a really strong clip, and even at rates well above even last year's really high totals. But even with starts on the single family side slowing, you still have a significant amount of new housing being built because of a number of issues kind of already mentioned around supply chain issues and building material shortages, right? It's taken longer and longer for builders to complete new homes and for those homes to ultimately reach the market. So right now, and for the past few months, there's been a rate of 1.7 million seasonally adjusted single family and multifamily housing units under construction, which is the highest number of homes under construction in more than 50 years. As these homes are ultimately completed, that will begin to bring additional relief to both for sale and rental markets, though high levels of construction for a period of years are really what's needed to get out of the supply deficit we're currently in. And I'm going to kick it back to Dan now, who's going to talk more about that supply deficit in the context of housing demand. Thanks, Dan.
Sure thing. Thanks, Alex. Yes, one of the major factors behind the high construction levels that we have been seeing, and also the tight markets and the rising housing costs, is that we've been riding a wave of significant growth in housing demand, specifically household growth. Household growth levels have ramped up over the past 10 years. Starting from levels around 750,000 per year. This chart is showing average annual household growth over the past decade. And we see here it's risen from just past the Great Recession 10 years ago, levels under 1 million, to 1.2 million for the middle of the last decade. But heading into the pandemic, we were seeing really substantial rates and levels of household growth, measured here from the 1.8 million per year from 2018 to 2020. That really did not subside much throughout the recession, or throughout the pandemic, from 2020 to 2022. So just only dipping a little bit to 1.6, so still substantial. And in our research, our household projections show that the rate of growth that we should see, based on fundamentals of population growth and change, is about 1.2 million per year. So we have been exceeding the baseline rates of household growth for several years now. Go to the next slide. You see what's been driving these high household growth numbers, and we have two factors I've circled here. One side on the right, we see the growth in older adult households, really piling on. It's really apparent here how much growth, the shifting, the aging of the population. But we look here at on the left, the younger and middle-aged households, kind of the millennial group, has really been the difference. There's been the growth in the older adult households has been high, and it grew a bit more from the early part of from 10 years ago to from the, I guess, the early part of the last decade to the later part. So since 2016, we really did see about a change of about, young adult household growth increased by about 400,000 per year. So that's really been the difference. And that's been kind of the release of pent-up demand from households, younger adults, millennials, who are for the first time seeing a good economy, rising wages. And as they were getting to ages where housing independence is much more important. So it was a late start, but really we saw the kind of emergence of household formation really kind of impacting household growth levels over the last 5 years leading into the pandemic, and even through the pandemic. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this has been tightening markets. So here is a look at household growth and construction levels. So household growth is the blue line, and the construction levels. So this is showing kind of the factors behind how this surging household growth has been tightening markets and where we are, at the end of all of this. But, historically, we need to build more housing more new housing than we have new households, because we lose households. There's tear downs we have to replace. People buy second homes. And so historically, construction levels have outnumbered household growth levels, but that has not happened for a long time. We see since the Great Recession, really construction levels got brought down in parity with household growth levels and have not been able to exceed it. And in fact, that's the latest surge in household growth has really pushed it even above nominal construction levels. So this is really showing how these surging household growth has kind of outpaced construction, tightened markets on the for sale side, the for rent side, and it's where we are now, talking about affordability challenges by a shortage of housing. So if we go to the next slide, we don't have much in terms of short-term trends in household growth. It's hard to kind of picture, but we do have some inklings. One of them is from the apartment property data, where we can look at the change in the number of occupied apartments year over year, and so looking at that number here in the dark blue line, we can see that since the publication of the State of the Nation's Housing Report, since over the 2022, we have seen a reduction in household growth among apartment renters, really just coming back to earth after exceedingly high numbers. Growth of 700,000 year over year growth in apartment renters back at the beginning of the year has subsided, but we can still see here, comparing it to apartment completions, still outnumbering completions. So helping a little bit ease the pressure but still, like a lot of the trends we're seeing, reductions reductions from super high levels to still pretty high levels since we published the report. And so we don't have too much in terms of growth in homeowner demand, but checking in on the theme that we were just seeing emerge when we put earlier in the year, the increasingly high hurdle of homeownership based on the high housing prices combined with the sharply rising interest rates. So if we go to the next slide, like household growth, a lot of the factors that were driving household growth were also driving growth in homeownership. We had growth in incomes, aging of the millennials. A lot of these factors were combined with the decline in interest rates that we saw in 2020 and 2021, and that really enabled millions of renters to enter home ownership. We see here that through the pandemic between 2020 and latest measure in the second quarter of 2022, we saw an increase of about 3 million homeowner households, which has pushed up the home ownership rates about a half a percentage point. If we can go to the next slide, but that's before we see the impact of rising prices and interest rates that have really raised the costs of buying a home significantly. So here we have a table that was in the report April to April, but added on what's happened since April. So the July number is the latest we have now, and what we see here is that looking at the interest rates up by about 2 percentage points between April 2021 and April 2022. That's combined with about a $50,000 increase in the median home price. That's continued to rise. So since April, home price has been up, median home price up another 10,000. Interest rates up about another 0.5% on average between April and the average for July. So this has had an extremely high impact on monthly mortgage payments. So put those prices and interest rates into standard mortgage 3.5% down. We see the monthly mortgage payments expected after having risen by $600 over 1 year to $2,000 by April 2022. That's gone up to about $2,200 for the median home. So the typical home, to purchase the typical home in July of 2022, you would have to, under these terms, you'd have to have $2,200 just to pay the monthly mortgage, factoring in taxes and insurance and those costs. That raises the total monthly owner costs of owning a typical home to about $3,000. And so what it takes, assuming typical lending standards, that means you would need about $115,000 to afford the typical priced home under current interest rates in July of 2022. So up from $79,600 in April of 2021. So significant growth in that requirement. It's really raised the bar on how much income you need to afford the monthly housing costs, and that's priced millions of potential homeowners out of the market. If we go to the next, we see here just a quick tab and saying how many renter households could potentially meet that income requirement. Fallen substantially, fallen from 10 million, that 10 million renters households in April 2021 who earned $79,600 or more, gone down to just 5 million. So more than cuts the pool of potential home buyers by about half, to just 5 million home buyers have $115,000 or in income or more. So really pricing a lot of people out of the market. If you go to the next slide, groups have not been priced out of the market evenly. We see here that that Black and Hispanic households, in particular, also low-income households, but we see the reduction by race really shows how the decline in the number of Black and Hispanic households, renter households who meet the income requirements in July of 2022 is down 60% from the number that could afford the median priced home back in April of 2021, compared to about 51% decline overall. So really, assuming the door is closing on affordable homeownership, it's really not closing evenly, but it's really locking in many inequalities in homeownership and housing markets. So if we go to the next slide, one of the themes we had focused on. So how is this happening? Next slide, please. Locking in inequalities. It's been a great time to be a homeowner. We saw here just a couple of days ago, CoreLogic released their latest annual equity report, showed year-over-year gains in home equity. We're actually up from what we reported earlier this year. They're up to the average homeowner gained $60,000 in equity over the past year. So substantial. Also record nominal amount of equity for those households. So really, but not every household is a homeowner. When we look at that compared to these persistent homeownership rate gaps by race, where Black households 30 percentage point lower homeownership rate than white households, Hispanic households about 25 percentage point. These are persistent. These are the white Black homeownership rate gap is about as large as it has been for decades. Really means that if the door is going to be closed on homeownership, it's going to make it that much harder to eliminate these homeownership rate gaps. Here we see the gaps it's not just an income story. Even within each income level, the racial homeownership rate gaps persist. The gaps not only are caused by wealth inequalities, but they also, we saw, if you miss out on some of those major gains in equity, it increases the wealth gap. So if we look to the next slide, the wealth gaps, racial wealth gaps are so significant. So they're both caused by and kind of perpetuate the homeownership rate gaps. So here we see that, but even among homeowners, we see in this white bar, the median wealth of Black homeowners is about a third of that of white homeowners. But overall, for all households, substantial gaps in wealth and income, all linked to gaps in homeownership rates. And so that brings us to an ongoing challenge that we see for the housing market. Our outlook here is really, we can go to the next slide, really what to be done to address the racial gaps in homeownership and income wealth. We've seen, increased attention on down payment assistance, on special purpose credit programs, which enable banks and other lenders to focus on race as a differentiation for lending programs to really address this. And so we look at that as an ongoing challenge that's gaining urgency. Other challenges that we outlined, gaining urgency, adapting the housing stock to mitigate the impacts of climate change. We saw the IRA was passed since we did this. That's kind of going along these lines. But also improving the accessibility for older adult households, accessibility to the housing stock for older adult households. Looking at this growth that we're expecting, when I showed the extremely high levels of growth in older adult households, that's continuing. 50% growth in households over age 65 by 2040. So this is something that we didn't focus on too much in this this presentation, but an urgent need to improve the housing stock to address just growing needs for older adult households. Also, long-term slowdown in household growth. We've seen the headlines, population growth hit 100-year lows for a couple of years in a row. Household growth is likely to follow. But overall, number one, increasing affordable housing options. So many of our challenges relate to the lack of affordable housing options for low and moderate income households. So if you go to the next slide, what can we do? Consensus, more and more consensus over building more stock that is affordable and addresses the needs. How can we do that? How are places doing it? First thing that we look at is regulatory reform, state and local levels, things that are looking at single family zoning, looking at increasing zoning levels, things that are done, state requirements for zoning to set standards that local zoning boards have to meet just in order to give higher density options a chance to be built across states. Also expanding availability of housing subsidies, because we know that the market it's not possible for the market to build housing affordable to the lowest income households. Subsidies are needed. And so expanding these to the households that can't afford market rate housing, increasingly crucial. Behind both of these, building on what we learned about the pandemic, about the impact that increasing housing subsidies, the emergency rental assistance, the impact that had, learning from how to reach households that, in ways that we had not before, in order to prevent evictions, prevent foreclosures through the pandemic. Learning about what, holding on to what we've learned and building on what we learned over the last 2-3 years, really going to be crucial. And so I leave you with kind of a summary of what we've talked about here. Basically, impacts of rising costs are being felt a bit more in the for sale markets right now, slowing in the for sale markets. Sales are slowing sales, allowing inventories to build, which is easing price appreciation rates, slowing demand, but also dragging down single family production that Alex talked about. Kind of a concern, given that we're still under producing housing overall over the past decade. So a concern there. Rental market staying tighter for longer, rents still high, vacancy rates still low, rents rising, the pace of increase of rents is moderating a bit, but a bit slowing. But we do see some hope on the horizon for rents, for rental affordability, because construction levels that Alex ended point, the pipeline of new units, we're expecting a lot of new apartment units to come online. So the hope is that is going to, with demand kind of easing, a pipeline of units coming online, looking forward to some easing of rent growth back to more kind of sustained levels that we've enjoyed historically. So I think there we are. We'll leave it at that. There's, as you found the webcast, but much more about data from the State Nations Housing, local, national data on our website, interactives. Please leave. But with that, I will turn it back to David to see if we have any questions.
Oh, we have many more questions than we have time. I want to thank both of you for a thorough, clear, provocative presentation, and I'm going to pick and choose here a little bit. I'm wondering, there are a variety of questions, all of which are, remind me of the old aphorism, it's very difficult to make predictions, particularly about the future, but both what you're seeing in terms of home prices and what you think the outlook is. And I want to pick up on particularly, there was one question saying, do we know anything about the interplay over time between spikes in mortgage interest rates and house prices? So given the data you presented, right, since it's, what can I afford in any given month? One might expect to either see prices fall or to stop rising or to rise at a slightly slower rate. So I'm just wondering where you think house prices may be going and in particular, what we know about that interplay.
So I'll give you a second to breathe, Dan. But low interest rates historically, right, allow potential home buyers to bid up home prices and keep their payments relatively stable, right? So low mortgage rates allow for prices to climb higher, and that's something that's actually quite different about and a reason for the pandemic increase in home prices that we've seen since 2020, basically, right? So with interest rates rising significantly over the course of this year, that's one of the major factors for the moderation in home prices and why we'd expect prices to continue to moderate, though not necessarily fall, certainly not in nominal terms. But yeah, no, there's definitely an interplay there. I don't know if Dan, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just thinking back about our effort here to update, what's happened. One of the kind of somewhat, noteworthy things to me was kind of the stickiness of prices, right? The slowdown in price appreciation was lagging. It takes a while, right? Prices are sticky. People don't want to lower their asking price, right? You might not get, with the rising interest rates, really reduce the purchasing power, right, of the buyers. It knocks a lot of people out of the market, so you have less competition. You lose the kind of boost a lot of places have been getting, right, that have been bids over asking. You might at first things slow down, and so that's the kind of hope, right, with rising interest rates, is that it just kind of cools an overheated market. Whether that leads to actual declines in prices is a separate story, but on its own, it's really kind of a cooling effect, I would think, would be the most likely result.
Interesting. I know some of you may have seen Mark Zandi had a piece in the Washington Post yesterday. The headline is "Home prices are expected to fall but not crash." So he's a little more pessimistic, I think, than you were just now. There were a couple of interesting questions about new housing, and I just want to highlight two. One was, any information we have about where new housing was being built, either particular parts of the country or the kind of that urban, suburban, exurban mix, and also what kinds of housing, and I think to what extent is it luxury, large housing, and on the apartment side, luxury. And I know this is something we've been tracking, and I thought it was worth highlighting.
One thing we didn't quite get to is how widespread the rise in construction has been. And if you go into the report, we talk about in what large markets is construction increasing. I think it's in 83 or so of the 100 large markets. Are you seeing a kind of rise in construction? So it's fairly widespread. And in terms of what's actually being built, right, is a significant part of the story. So new housing that is built is increasingly expensive. It's tended to be larger, and this is a long-term story. The pandemic has played potentially a role in it as well. And I think that's true in some sense on the for sale and the single family and multifamily side. There's almost two separate but related stories happening there. On the multifamily side, what's being built it tends to be larger multifamily structures and in dense urban areas, right, for the most part. And that's contributed to the rising costs, and in some ways the how much longer it's taken to complete new housing, especially on the multifamily and apartment side.
Just to follow up on that, and have you seen any data out of places yet, like Oregon or California, which, as Dan noted, have made it easier to build denser housing? Do we have any sign yet that that's producing either more units and any kind of a different mix of units? And I understand that the answer might be we don't know yet.
I think largely people are starting to study that, right? I mean, the initial indications are, you'd expect it to take, you know, it's not going to be as easy as building on a huge green, you know, green spot where you can build a whole subdivision, you know, but it'll take some time, I think. So I think we can look forward to kind of future measurements to show the impact of these laws on actually densifying and producing units, what it means in terms of units. But yeah.
There's an interesting question that sort of it pairs in my mind to the points about evictions. Are you seeing any notable changes in foreclosures? Or would you expect to, given the kinds of other changes that are going on in the broader economy?
Yeah, I mean, the foreclosures really kind of jumped. I think they still remain, you know, kind of where they were before the pandemic. But yeah, it's you know, hadn't had such a rebound as the eviction data had. You know, there's a bit of a change just when kind of the protections ended at the turn of the, you know, in January, but they've remained kind of, yeah, they've remained low.
Even as I asked that, I was thinking that the rise in equity suggests that foreclosures might still remain low. That if you couldn't afford the payments, you might then.
Right. Given that you know, average equity levels is up $60,000, that kind of gives a nice buffer.
And
also wages. I mean, unemployment is, you know, a bigger driver of foreclosures probably would be unemployment. Unemployment rates down, wages are still, you know, up. So the ability to pay, you know, is still pretty strong.
And Chris Herbert has just mentioned, who's in the background, has just messaged me that don't forget that forbearance worked really well, and that the homeowner assistance available through the pandemic played a huge role. Could you just talk a little bit broadly about the role that both homeowner assistance and then a little bit later rental assistance played, and what you're watching as those programs have come to an end?
I think they've both played a significant role in staving off the worst of the worst and what could have been, right? It's always hard to think of what the counterfactual could be, and you'll see a bunch of empirical papers attempt to assess, you know, like consider that counterfactual over, you know, the next several years. But those kinds of assistance programs certainly put renters and homeowners on a better foot. And I think one of the primary intentions and primary motives, something we've covered in the last couple of housing reports that we've put out, right, have really done a mostly good job of keeping households in their homes, which was, you know, a major intent of those programs.
We're coming up on the 1:15 time, and I apologize. There's a extraordinarily rich conversation. We'll look through, as I said, the questions are just really helpful for us to know, what it is that people are concerned with. I want to end actually with a double-sided question for each of you, and you can pick and choose how you want to answer it, which is, given where we were in June, I'm wondering first, what has most surprised you as you kind of looked at what's happened since that, you said we were at an inflection point, and then looking forward over the next 3 months, are there particular indicators that you are going to be paying especially close attention to that'll help you think about, if we were to do this presentation in 3 months, what are the most important things that are coming out that you're going to be looking at? So what surprised you, and what are you looking forward, which data or information are you looking forward to getting?
So I guess I'll start with what data to kind of keep an eye on moving forward. I think inventories obviously are always an indicator to look at to see where the housing market is just going generally, right? And they've started to turn to an extent, but not nearly to the levels you'd hope they'd be at. We're not near at all where you'd want to be or balanced. And the other thing is housing production that Dan kind of talked about at the end. There's obviously a large number of new units we hope will eventually come online, but it is in some ways discouraging to see single family housing starts kind of start to tumble down back to where they were. Is that a short-term blip? Is that something long-term? What does it mean for a home building industry if you can't sustain high levels of housing construction in an environment that isn't, boosted by extraordinarily low interest rates, right? So what that looks like and how to respond to it going forward are kind of important questions to me.
Dan?
I'm going to keep looking at inventory levels. I think that's interesting. I think I was saying earlier that I was surprised at how slow prices were to react to the sharp jump in costs. I mean, just calculating how much the rising interest rates kind of impacted, monthly costs. I was surprised that, sales went down, but there were still a lot of sales happening and prices were staying up. And it was kind of like, how are prices still so high? And how it's really kind of, to me, it was a reflection of so many markets have so low the inventories are so low in so many markets that there's still competition. There's still plenty of competition to kind of fuel how high prices. And so I would want to kind of look at these key markets, look at what the inventory levels are there as kind of a sense for, are we finally getting some normalcy back in this buying process?
Dan, I'm surprised. I thought you would have flagged some of the household growth numbers, which I know you've been trying to wrestle with. And I know I was just thinking about both the demographic trends, whether or not immigration ever rebounds. And I thought it was really interesting, your point about the long-term demand. Well, we've come to the end of our time. I'm familiar with the report. I'm familiar with recent things, and yet I still find myself when I sit and I listen to the data about prices, what's happened to prices, what's happened to interest rates, what's happened to rents, some of the construction trends. To think that we've seen a 50% reduction in the pool of plausible first-time buyers, and the persistence of the the long-term and really troubling racial and ethnic homeownership gaps. Just I can't thank you too and my other colleagues at the Joint Center enough for maintaining a steady attention on this. I was also thinking that in many ways your presentation helps sets the stage for some of the upcoming talks. So Jacob Anbinder's talk in 2 weeks, which is really about the politics and history of the resistance that has grown up to a lot of new residential construction. And then the discussion that Jen Malinsky will be part of, kind of exploring a lot of the issues around older homeowners. You have, as often has been the case when we start the fall semester with this presentation, really set the stage for those talks. I encourage those folks who are attending to both come to those talks, and if you haven't done so already, to go to our webpage to sign up, not only to hear about our events, but for our blog, because as new data comes out, the first place that we'll often be wrestling with that will be, in our blog, which in part is a way to not have to wait. And then, of course, we will eagerly await the next State of the Nation's Housing Report, which I know you two will ably captain, and look forward to doing a presentation again. Unfortunately, you can't see everybody, but I think I speak for the many people who are watching to thank you for a terrific piece of work and a terrific presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.